but all the major announcements were made until about 5:15, and maybe now they may be winding up, but I have logged off that one. Clearly, it is very challenging times for the country and for all of us individually as well. And I think this is where AIMA's role is very important, that as management professionals, each one of us on this call, what can we do to see that we are able to grow India's economy and manage it the best way? Part of the problem with this COVID situation is that it is a moving target, and therefore you don't know what the developments are, and therefore nobody has a right answer. So therefore, we from the management fraternity have to certainly help navigate our colleagues through this difficult period, and to see how we can best, manage this tumultuous time and take it forward. But just wait for Rekha to get an update as to what is going on.
Oh, I can't see him. I understand Dr. Subramanian has joined us. Dr. Subramanian, can you hear me? This is Rekha Sethi, Director General of the All India Management Association.
We can't. I don't see his name in the participant unless he is joined from an ID that.
Because I just spoke to his office and they said he's joined, but I think he's going to try again, logging in again.
There's a B Krishnamurthy Rekha that I see, so I don't know. Dr. Subramanian, we can't see you. Could you speak something? Is your mic on mute? Even if we don't see you.
I think he's here, but I think since we don't know his ID, his mic might be on mute. So I'm requesting my colleagues to quickly unmute his mic.
Yes, it's a KVS, I think. Just take a look. Yeah, the mic is unmuted at this point.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes. Good evening, Dr. Subramaniam. Sorry for this confusion. Delighted to have you here with us. And I think this is just the right time to have you amongst us because all of us probably have many questions for you. So before going, without wasting any time, I'm going to hand over the proceedings to Mr. Harshpati Singhania, Senior Vice President of AIMA, and request him to take over.
Dr. Subramaniam, a very warm welcome to you from behalf of AIMA. Ladies and gentlemen, we are very privileged to have Dr. Krishnamurthy Subramanian, the Chief Economic Advisor, with us here. Dr. Subramaniam, good to see. I had a brief look at your background and I can see you were in office. The last time I had a conversation with you, I think both of us were stuck at home, and I'm in my office as well. So that is one development, certainly. AIMA has been running a series of conversations with top policymakers and business leaders under the Leaders Speak program. And therefore, we are really delighted that you are a part of this program today. You have achieved a lot in your career. You probably are the youngest Chief Economic Advisor, and you also worked in the corporate sector. So you've seen all kinds of things, and being from IIT and IIM and your Chicago PhD all adds to this whole thing. So, ladies and gentlemen, I don't want to stand between you and Dr. Subramaniam, but may I just put it this way, that we have seen the Prime Minister announce yesterday a very large stimulus, which combined, of course, with what has been announced earlier, would be 10% of GDP. And Dr. Subramaniam, we've had several conversations at forums talking about the need for a large stimulus. So maybe you could talk a little bit about how you see the Indian economy unfolding. How are we going to recover from where we are? Because what is amply clear at this point is that we are obviously in very tough times, and we are likely to see a negative growth scenario. And while there has been a partial opening, the challenge still remains that demand creation is a very big challenge. And we have seen that even units that have started up, and I can speak from personal experience, where we have started up some units, but we've had to either temporarily again shut them or curtail production because the front end is not pulling. And this entire chain, the supply chain, the entire MSMEs, which are really suffering a lot in the trade and commerce, they are all linked to this. So how do we really come through this, and what is the way forward? And in the context of what the Prime Minister and now the Finance Minister today has announced, if you could put that in perspective. Thank you, and welcome once again.
Thank you very much, Harsh, and very good evening to all the participants in this session. Let me first acknowledge that I'm very happy to be here amongst you to share my thoughts. I think it's stating the obvious if I say that we're actually living through historical times, and times when we will look back and reminisce, with hopefully in a positive way. But what is, I think, amply clear is that none of us has really encountered times like this in our lives. I can say certainly for myself. Maybe earlier wars, etc., which thankfully I have not had the, the reason to be part of yet, actually, or living through such times. But this is a warlike situation in some sense, but with important differences. And what I'll do is, before I actually comment on the ideas behind the package, behind not just the package but the vision that's been laid out for the economy by the Honorable Prime Minister yesterday. Before I get into that, what I'll try and do is to give you a sense of what can we expect. I think everything that I say or anybody else says, any analyst, I would strongly recommend participants to to continually recalibrate, because if there's anybody who basically says that he or she can speak with confidence about what will happen in the next 11 10 to 12 months, either he is a charlatan or an astrologer of infinite capacity. I think rest of us, all humans, will have to basically be humble enough to admit that that we have to continually recalibrate. Now, one thing that I do want to actually highlight, though, is that while we make judgments, we also must be aware of some of the human frailties that all of us are subjected to. And I speak based on my understanding of behavioral economics here. One of the biases which affects our decision making significantly, all humans, is what is called the saliency bias. And it seems like a very scary term, but it's very simple to understand. Which is that when we are going through normal times, we keep thinking that those normal times will continue, and we really put very low weight on the probability of, or a chance of a black swan event. Now, the same thing happens once we are actually going through a black swan event. Then we overweight the chances of us continuing in that black swan event, and basically discount the possibility of going back to normal times. This is covered very, very well in a book that I highly recommend all of you to read, Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow, by the person who won the Nobel Prize for his research in behavioral economics, Daniel Kahneman. He highlights this, and that's something which all of us must be wary about. That this is a human frailty, human bias that we all are subjected to. So, it's quite possible that all of us may be making judgments which are affected by this bias, and therefore we may possibly be more pessimistic than we need to be if you were making perfectly rational assessments. I say this based on the research that has been done for the Spanish flu episode of 1918, 1919, which happened 100 years back. Now, research, the advantage of that is basically it's evidence. And by the way, if some of you have questions, we can engage. Some of you might wonder what's the relevance of something that happened 100 years back to now. Legitimate question, but actually, rather than getting sidetracked by that, let me just tell you that it is extremely relevant. For one, it is the pandemic that is comparable in order to what COVID, what we're encountering with COVID. None of the other pandemics, come even close. And here I think it's useful to just give you some statistics. The R0 parameter, which basically captures the number of people who are likely to be infected by an infected person, is about 2.2 to 2.3 for the Spanish flu, and about 2.4 for COVID. Just to contrast, how other episodes cannot be really employed as a good proxy, for rational assessment of what might happen in the future. The common influenza that comes every year has an R naught of about 1.2, while the smallpox or Ebola have R naughts in excess of 3.5. So the COVID from a pandemic point of view is actually the closest proxy. In terms of the devastation that the pandemic caused, 1/3 of the global population was infected by the Spanish flu. Just to give you a comparison, less than 1% of the population today is affected by COVID. So even if you allow for the fact that in the 100 years that have passed since then, a population has, let's say, increased about 2.5, 3 times. Even then, the number of people that is infected is actually an order of magnitude lower than what it was during the Spanish flu. That's point number one, to basically capture the devastation. Point number two is that the mortality rates among the people who were infected, the mortality rates were 10% for about 10% for the Spanish flu. Global average for COVID is about 3.4%. So, which means the mortality rate is about 1/3. And in India in particular, our recovery rates are higher and our mortality rates are also lower than the global averages. So which is also something that we must keep in mind. Now, the reason I actually am comparing to a pandemic that was actually of a similar order but was far more devastating is that even with such devastation, the economic impact, economic output was a V-shaped recovery, which means that if you think about it, basically there's a decline in output and then it goes up. Now, if you put together what I've said is the fact that quite likely all of us are affected by this human frailty of saliency bias, which is overweighting recent experiences, especially those that are more fearful, for instance, and the fact that the only rational piece of evidence that we can gather is from the Spanish flu, which generated a V-shaped recovery despite it being far more devastating pandemic, then I think it's a reasonable judgment to make, with all the uncertainty that we should have a V-shaped recovery even in India. And I acknowledge that among all the economists, I have been the only person who's actually gone on almost on one leg, actually claiming this based on the research. And I will make I think I do not want to be infected by certainly not by corona, but I don't want to be infected by saliency bias either. And that's one of the reasons why I actually have. So India, it's quite likely that we will have a V-shaped recovery. Yes, things, the way things stand now, they do look very bad. But just imagine how things would have looked, during the Spanish flu, with 1/3 of the population infected and 10% rates. People would have been far, far more scared, and yet it actually generated a V-shaped recovery. So this is something that I just want to, to put across to you. Many of you may not agree with me, and that's fine. This is a situation where all of us have to employ, each one's judgment. I would rather actually, use judgment that is devoid of some of the biases that I'm worried about. So that said, now, so if there is going to be a V-shaped recovery, in the short run, or till that recovery happens, what is the key impact? And Harsh alluded to this. So if you go back to first principles, and by the way, for those of you, because this is the AIMA, the management graduates, I think, and management professionals should always employ, look to employ thinking from first principles, because while you may encounter completely new situations, but thinking from first principles always, I think, leads to far more rigorous thinking, and and possibly therefore better assessments and better decisions. So that's something I strongly encourage, and I myself employ a lot. So if from first principles in economics, what we really always use is supply and demand. Now, if you take a war, and COVID is a war-like situation, but not exactly a war. What are the key differences? Let's understand that. When you have a war, because people, are worried about, there's uncertainty in a war, people will not basically go and, go on, for basically tourist places. People will not indulge that much in discretionary spending, so services usually gets impacted. Essential consumption, holds the economy together. Discretionary spending goes down significantly. That's what happens in a warlike episode. I think something similar is happening and will happen in the case of the COVID as well. There's an important difference that in a war, what happens is, because of the bombing, etc., that happens, many factories basically just, get reduced to ashes, become rubble. And so that generates important supply side disruptions. Now, this is a crucial difference in the case of COVID, that there is no factory that has basically gotten destroyed, or, which is where infrastructure is lost. So that part of, in other words, capital, which basically just completely destroyed and has to be, set up, physical factories, equipment that gets destroyed, and it takes its time for it to, for it to be rebuilt. And the time that it takes, actually, therefore, there are likely to be a lot of supply side constraints. That is not something that is happening or will happen in the case of a pandemic. So that's an important distinction. Now, does that mean that there will be no supply side impact? No, I'm not, that's not what I'm saying. There will be some supply side impact, but that supply side impact will come from demand side effects. What do I mean by that? Which is, if you have, demand going down like it has during the lockdown period, then, because of lower demand, companies may not be able to, accumulate as much revenues. They may not be able to sell as much, but they, a lot of their fixed costs can, are likely to be to basically be borne even during these periods. And variable costs also, while they may be able to decline, or they may be able to proportionally reduce their variable costs, they may not be able to reduce it significantly, may be able to, I think maybe reduce it by 50-60% depending upon the sector. So you have a situation where fixed costs continue to be what they are, variable costs are much, are lower, but maybe not completely lower. As a result, basically the firm gets into liquidity issues. And these liquidity problems, which is, temporary problems about cash flows, etc., that may create also, that may create problems on solvency for firms. Now, that it's very important to distinguish this supply side impact into two broad categories. And this is important because, for any economy, money does not grow on trees, and therefore, when you direct spending, you actually have to direct it where the bang for the buck is higher. So there are those firms which basically, before the COVID itself, were in a very poor shape. In other words, they basically had some problem with their businesses. They maybe, take for instance, some sectors, like for instance, take the automobile sector, which is experiencing a, possibly an important shift in demand towards, more renewables, etc. So it's likely that we are in a phase where automobile sector is maybe, is a more sunset sector. So there may be other sectors as well. Now, if there are sectors that are going to be fundamentally not viable because their demand is going to suffer a permanent shock, then one has to actually think about, such firms, whether it actually is good bang for the buck, because you don't want to be putting good money after bad. And that's what works. That's important to understand in a market economy, that resources have to get reallocated to those sectors where the bang for the buck is higher. Contrast, for instance, let's say some sunrise sectors versus sunset sectors. That's an important. In other words, sectors and firms that are likely to be, which were, let's say, less viable even before the crisis, COVID crisis, they are ones that we have to think about. But there are firms which actually, and sectors which were viable, very much viable. But then, the COVID actually is creating, difficulties for them. Those firms need to be supported definitely. And it's, that's where it's really critical to sort of support for some firms. It's and that's really critical. In this, you also have to keep in mind that that destruction and creative destruction in a market economy, unfortunately, is something which is required to some extent, because inefficient firms have to actually have to basically die. They do create some difficulties in the short run, but they have to die, and workers have to get reallocated, possibly retrained, and go into sectors where they actually are, they're going to be more productive. So this is an important aspect that we must keep in mind. Now let me talk about the in this context, what is the vision that that we are basically trying to articulate for the new India. First, I think this episode has clearly shown, and the Prime Minister highlighted it as well, is that we need to have domestic capabilities, especially in some of the strategic sectors. It could be health, it actually is defense, telecom, for instance, maybe some sectors we need to have strategically important sectors, we need to have domestic capabilities. And that's what basically, Atmanirbhar Bharat really means. Atmanirbhar Bharat does not mean closing our doors, because when we close our doors, what happens is basically, stop competition. And, when you stop competition, complacency gets enhanced, and that basically reduces the competitiveness of firms. So that is not what Atmanirbhar Bharat actually means. It's comes from self-confidence, and that which itself comes from capabilities. An important aspect of the Atmanirbhar Bharat, and something that the PM touched upon as well, which is demand. If you take some of the large economies, the United States, China, for instance, and India, because we have such a large population, our firms can actually produce for catering to the demand, in India. Now, one of the aspects that, if you see, a lot of our firms have tried to focus more on products and services that are deliverable to, let's say, the top 20-30% of the population in terms of the demography. But I'll take an example from the FMCG sector, for instance. About 20 years back, if you looked at shampoos or hair oils, etc., which basically the poor also wanted to use, they would not be able to afford it, because their cash flow cycles were very different. They basically would work for a week, get cash. So if they could afford, basically, when these were made available in sachets, for instance, shampoo sachets or hair oil sachets, now it's the same product which they also wanted to consume, but because it was packaged and made into a small sachet, the price point was much lower, and so the same product basically the poor also could afford. This is an example of actually manufacturing for the bottom of the pyramid, which is something that, given the large economy, large consumer base that we have, unfortunately our corporations, actually India Inc. has not exploited enough. In FMCG sector actually stands out as an exception, and to some extent now, if you look at how affordable housing, there's something of that is happening. But across the board, if you look at, and maybe a nano was an attempt actually along that direction, but there is far more. The opportunity in this is just significant, and our companies need to actually think creatively how they can take the same product or service and maybe tweak either the price point or the offering itself a little bit, so that they actually can go and utilize it. One more example I'd give you is the prepaid, for instance, prepaid mobile versus the postpaid. If you look at research in consumer behavior, typically the poorer folks actually use a lot more prepaid connections than the postpaid connections, and that's because prepaid, actually you have a commitment. You, let's say, you're recharging for $100, then you'll spend it more judiciously, because if it's a postpaid, then you may not spend it as judiciously. So these are examples of products and services that can be tailored and actually made for the Indian economy, and thereby take the vision of basically local that can be made global, which is what the PM has talked about. Because if these products and services are appealing to a large part of the bottom section of the bottom of the pyramid, then they basically clear the threshold that is required for the for that product or service to basically be economically viable, and then that strengthens that brand or the product, and which can then be exported as well. So this is something which for all companies and all management graduates and management professionals, I want to leave this as an idea that Atmanirbhar Bharat also means being able to come up with products and services that can be tailored to these. One final example is microfinance, for instance, of financial services being taken to the to basically to the poorer. So this proposition that products and services can only be delivered in a profitable way by private enterprise only if it is catered to the top 20-30% of the demography in terms of the income needs to be challenged, and needs to be this is where creativity, Indian creativity, needs to come in, and that will be the first foundational stone for Atmanirbhar Bharat to actually to happen. That's sort of with that, let me just get into some details about the package, and then I'm happy to take questions. So as I had said when I talked about the COVID episode itself, it's primarily a demand side effect, with basically it having supply side ramifications, because of the lower demand can actually make put firms under stress. So and this is far more likely among the MSMEs. We, for instance, actually analyzed the data as well. When we look at the proportion of by basically the size of firms. Now let me concede here that it's not as if larger firms are not affected, but I'm talking about the relative impact. When you segregate the firms based on their size, and we've looked at the balance sheets, we basically have looked at stuff like interest coverage ratio, the liquidity ratios, etc. What we find is that MSMEs in this, in India, actually about 60% of them, are under stress. In contrast, large firms, when we do the same numbers, large firms, about 10 to 15% of them, would be in stress, while the MSME is about 60%. Now, go back to my argument about the bang for the buck. Therefore, it is important, because MSMEs also are important job creators, not to say that large firms are not important job creators. They are as well, but they're far better situation than the MSMEs. And so, given the need for targeting well, the package that the Honorable Finance Minister announced today for the MSMEs, I think, is a very, very comprehensive one. Basically 6 steps. One is your about 3 lakh crores of credit, and it's 100% guaranteed, up to an increase in the term loan / working capital limit of 20%, which is a good significant number. Just to give you why it is a good number, because a typical firm, let's say, turns its inventory, if you say about 4 or 5 times a year, then about a 25% increase, 20 to 25% increase. This adds to 10% that banks are themselves doing. So becomes 30%. They'll be able to tide over their inventory, and over their cash flow problems for at least a quarter, and maybe beyond. That's why the increase in the term loan and working capital limits with 100% guarantee. Why are we giving the 100% guarantee? So that this does not suffer because the risk aversion of banks, that banks basically don't feel any risk at all, and they therefore on lend this. The sub debt scheme for firms that are, now the first scheme, this basically credit is for firms that are not under stress. Those are actually those which are not SMA or stressed. But then for stressed firms and firms that are in NPA, that there's been some relief that has been provided through the sub debt scheme. Then there is also the fund of funds for equity infusion into SMEs, because without equity, oftentimes debt, more debt only makes them, vulnerable, because at some point in time when they have to, repay. So that's the fund of funds, change in the definitions of the SME, of the MSMEs, SMEs, etc., so that they can actually size limits especially have been increased, and it's been made based on both the investment and turnover, so that the perverse incentive that remains for firms to be small so that they can continue to enjoy these benefits, that perverse incentive is reduced, significantly. This should enable growth of MSMEs further. And then there are a few other one is basically on the dues that are due from government and to by PSUs to MSMEs to be cleared within 45 days. And the last bit is the on the global tenders, and enabling basically MSMEs to have a preferential treatment here. So I think this is a very comprehensive set of measures for the MSMEs. We can talk about some of the other measures, but I think in the context of what I said, that the MSMEs are really far more stressed, I think this is really important. Let me just end by saying that the 10% of GDP includes basically fiscal measures, includes liquidity, and includes includes the monetary measures as well. Now the good thing about this is that the components for the monetary and the liquidity part are far more than the fiscal one, because the fiscal one actually can create concerns, and I've actually spoken about this elsewhere as well. That the fiscal part is large, but but it's complemented by the liquidity and the monetary measures. And finally, one of the things that as Deng Xiaoping used to say, the Chinese premier, saying, I don't care about the color of the cat as long as it catches mice. So we don't have to necessarily make distinctions between the fiscal versus monetary versus liquidity, as long as they actually are able to enable firms to tide over their difficulties now. So I think together with the reform measures and bunch of reforms, actually, especially on you would have already been reading on labor, and on land. Labor, for instance, you have Madhya Pradesh, Uttar Pradesh, and Gujarat doing it. Land, Karnataka, for instance, in APMC, which is product market reforms, that a lot of states are doing. And these are, by the way, are very, very important. So in some sense, actually, we are in a 1991 kind of situation. There also we had responded with significant reforms, and here too we are actually doing really important reforms. I'll leave you with this with this thought, especially when you see some of the opposition that is voiced against these reforms, that when this government came back to power, a lot of people were saying, now, why isn't the government doing reforms? It has the majority to be able to, and it has come back with a majority, actually, why not do reforms? And now when reforms are being done, some people are basically also saying this is not the right time, etc. So if those of you who would who may have followed the events in 1991 will remember that when and it was P.V. Narasimha Rao who actually really instrumented these reforms. And if you remember, some of the people within his own party were also opposing it at that time. The likes of M.L. Photedar, Arjun Singh, Balram Jhakar, etc. And now you can look back and see whom do we remember? Do we remember those that basically grabbed the opportunity, historic opportunity to do the reforms, or those that were actually creating difficulties in implementing those reforms? And also keep in mind that when you think about these, and many of the people who are hearing may not even heard these names. I do remember, because this was when I actually was getting interested in economics, and so I was following some of these events when I was in college at that time. So and the other last point to remember is some of these people actually don't necessarily strike you, those that were opposing, as reformers. In fact, these seem to be people who preferred status quo because they possibly benefited from it. So that's the last bit of comment on reforms and the political economy of reforms. I think I would end again by reminding you what I said at the outset, which is that first, don't get too pessimistic. Realize the human frailty, the bias that we tend to extrapolate both good times and bad times, far more than we should. If you are being a little bit more rational, then you'll actually realize, and this is not just me saying it, this is Nobel Prize winning research that says that we need to be far more rational in putting probability on what is beyond the current as well, which is and I spoke about the Spanish episode. So India will emerge much stronger out of this, especially because of the measures that are being taken now. And that only adds to what has what I've already spoken about, which is the fact that as they say, ye bhi badlega. This time will also change, and change in a good way. And thank you very much for your patient listening, and I'm happy to take questions now.
Thank you very much, Dr. Subramanian, for those remarks. And you did lay out some of the thinking behind the government's thinking in terms of how it is going to approach a revival issue. And you also talked about two or three, I mean, many things, but two or three which particularly struck me. The fact that really demand creation, which we have been talking about, is going to be the key. The difference being the supply side is currently hampered, but not destroyed, like in a warlike situation. But it impacts that. And many other things. And therefore, the other point which I took away was clearly the issue of targeting spending wherever there is going to be or likely to be maximum impact. So I think those were some key things. Now we have a chat board here full of questions, and I really don't know how to approach all of them. So what I'm going to do, if you permit, is I am going to sort of ask or paraphrase some of those questions and put it. It might be more efficient, the use of your time as well. So there are several questions, and if you don't mind, it depends on how you want to play it. Do you want me to put out two or three questions, and then maybe you put it that way, or would you like to respond to?
Yeah, I think it may be useful if there are sort of questions in a theme, then you collate them together. Sure. I think that may be good.
Sure. So one clearly several things, but one theme which is clearly there is about employment and jobs, which is how, to what extent is the impact of that, and how are we really going to recreate those jobs? One understands that through the stimulus, through the liquidity, both the financial and the monetary side, that is the attempt. But how much time might it be before, I wouldn't say all, but a substantial part of the employment comes back? Or are we likely to see some structural shifts in employment patterns within the economy and sector? So one clearly is that. I don't know, would you like to take that first, and then we can
No, I think episodes like these always lead to important structural breaks, and I think we're already seeing. For instance, I can share with you that personally, I may think of actually not necessarily traveling so much for interactions, and use virtual means like the ones that we are using now. So if you think about the employment impact of something like that, then those firms which may have done physical event management activities, the demand for that may be impacted in a negative manner permanently, and those that actually will be able to do such events virtually, there the demand will be there will be a permanent increase. Now, given this reconfiguration, then there has to be therefore a reconfiguration of employment as well. So those employees who may have so far had skills in doing, let's say, physical event management activities, may have to get reskilled actually, and then into virtual event management activities. So this is just an example of what I'm talking about. some sectors where where there is going to be a permanent impact in demand, will have to people there will have to retrain. And as we go along, and as some of this becomes clear, the government may also have to think about helping this retraining process of employees, so that they can they can sort of find jobs in areas where there are, because it's important to ensure that we especially in a situation like this, we do not continue to put good money after bad, and that is I think something that we have to keep in mind. So there will be some impact, undoubtedly. And to tell you, just so that people, and I don't think this is any sucker, but we must acknowledge that this is not just in India. For instance, in the United States, the number of job claims, the number of unemployment insurance claims are at a historical high, higher than even during the period of the Great Depression. So every economy will go through some of these some of these aspects. But let me tell you, in the maybe a year and a half period, what will happen is far more investment is likely to come in with the reforms that are being worked on, and thereby create employment too. I can't hear you.
Sorry, I muted myself. Thank you. Keeping on with that theme, just one other question, which is actually forefront of everybody's mind. We are all reading and seeing a lot about this whole migrant labor issue. Now, the practical side of that is, while we understand their plight, and what happened was that, unfortunately, when the lockdown was easing and when we started opening up for business, that was the time when the migrant labor, the trains and the transport started. So that has been, in terms of timing, an issue. And today, the issue is even sectors that have been open. Let's say construction, the government talked about. Government talked about restarting plants. This is a genuine problem of how do you retain people? How do you get them, let's say, re-attract them? They came there in the first instance because they thought prospects were better than from where they were living, leaving their families behind. Now, are there any, I know this is not your sort of, your portfolio, but this is a serious economic impact issue where businesses are unable to start or restart, or even infrastructure for that matter, till this is resolved. Any thoughts around this as to how best we can together tackle this?
See, okay. Firstly, a quick clarification. Anything that relates to the economy actually is something that relates to me. So happy to share my thoughts on this. I have two responses to this. One at a more fundamental level, and which is therefore spanning a much larger period of time. And second is more immediate and therefore a practical. Firstly, and I speak about this in the context of some of the labor reforms, etc., that we are doing. If you ask yourself, and I'm sure maybe this, at least in this crowd, I might be preaching to the choir, but it is a fact that 89% of the labor force is in the unemployed, is in the informal sector, because labor laws have been so stringent. And the parallel I use is, I don't know about people like you, but I'm sure, but those of us who come from very humble backgrounds, we have had the, and now looking back, I'd say the privilege of traveling in a third-class compartment in the Indian Railways. And one of the things that has stood out from me, in that is whoever got into the third-class bogie, in the first station where the train originates, basically would, had, it's like squatters' rights, wouldn't enable anybody else to come in after that. So every station after the original station, there are people who wanted to travel to their destinations as well, but they wouldn't be able to, to travel. And these are like the informal sector workers who also want, So the situation in the case of labor in India is very similar, which is the 11%, the minority, which is the equivalent minority in those that got into the unreserved bogie or the third class compartment. They are able to enjoy the privileges, but there's a large majority which basically ends up suffering as a result. And this is an important aspect that is being now being unwound through the labor market reforms, because you have to ask yourself that why do we have such large migrant labor? If we had enough formal jobs in the formal sector, and let's say across the country, then in many cases they may actually be able to they would have been able to work. Also, the other it's related to skilling and demand and supply of labor as well. Part of the reasons why industry wants to hire this migrant labor is also because the local labor may be demanding a higher wage, and that the migrant labor can actually be hired at a much lower wage. And therefore so one of the which then sort of segues me into the response in terms of the short run response. So first thing, I think in the short run, industry will have to actually look to hire local labor, and possibly have to pay a higher wage. In any case, because of the shortage of migrant labor, wages have gone up, so that's something that industry will have to do. But what we are, some of the steps that we are taking now will enable the, job creation, and thereby actually enable us to sort of tackle this migrant labor problem in a far more permanent way. Related to that, one other thing which is important is the part of the reason why the migrant labor has gone back is because the vulnerability that they suffer, which is, for instance, they don't have access to the PDS, the public distribution system. Now, once, for instance, if you have, let's say, the portability of the ration card, one nation, one card, then they will be able to access cereals actually, and use the Food Security Act, and thereby reduce their vulnerability on that part. So in some sense, what we need to do, and this is something that where government and industry will have to work together, is also enable some of the conditions for migrant labor, and enable that. And I think what is what this situation is doing is, there's a saying in Hindi that छाँव का मतलब तभी पता चलता है जब आप धूप में जाते हो. So for industry, actually, now that migrant labor has gone out, the value of migrant labor is being felt, and that's the other aspect that we need to, not just industry but even government as well. So I think the lesson here is we need to also think about investing in these, providing them better conditions. The reason they're going back is because they fear about their lives, in the cities where they work. So these are aspects that we all have to think about. I think in the short run, the government is also working on steps like the portability of the PDS system, maybe some more incentives for migrant labor to come back. But industry will also have to do its bit and enhance the conditions of some of these workers as well.
Thank you. I'll turn to one of our past presidents, Jalan. He was very keen to ask you a question. Could you go ahead?
Mr. Subramanian, very easy to relate to you because you and I, we speak the same language. We understand each other. We understand the way that reform should be done and the free economy should come in. We are also born entrepreneurs and risk takers, and so are optimists. If we are not that, we can never be working and taking risks. So we were very enthused by what the Prime Minister said. He took us completely by surprise, pleasant surprise, and we are very excited about it. My worry is only a small twofold, that it should not get bogged down in the process. India has a terrible track record when it comes to bureaucracy. And they will go on getting finer and finer and finer points till they delay it and debate it and bring it to an end by which time it is unproductive. Second is, is when you rightly talked about creation of demand. The demand can easily be created, as you know better than anyone else, if the banks are ready to help, and the NBFCs, which were the lower banks, are ready to help people to buy. Now, they themselves are so scared of lending that they are not ready to lend. And even if the Reserve Bank asks them to lend, they say, no, but we won't. Who will stand for us when a question is raised later? And these are practical things which the government has to accept. Thank you.
No, absolutely. I think let me, lest there is any impression that the government does not recognize or does not accept these things, especially with respect to public sector banks. I think I'll share with you candidly that part of my, I think one large part of my frustration, over the last several months has been the public sector banks. I think, for instance, there has been the claim that has been made that lending has not happened because demand for credit is not there, which I don't agree. I've not agreed since July. I have, and I don't agree either now. In fact, we looked at we passed out the data, looking at private sector banks are lending far more than the public sector banks. So if it were a demand side issue, then you should be seeing a similar impact actually for private sector and public sector banks. So it can't just be a demand side problem. We clearly have a supply side problem on the lending side, which is because of the risk aversion. And in some sense, my frustration has also been is, given many of the costs that we also encounter with the public sector banks during normal times, the reason we have actually them nationalized is so that they can be really, helping during times like this. That said, I think, you might have actually read about today how the amount of credit that has gone. I think there's a nice article in Mint today, actually in the front page, which covers the amount of credit that has been given by the public sector banks since March, and so they have really stepped up now in the, together with that, I think the package that has been announced for NBFCs, especially the buyer of last resort, which actually will help them a lot, and the credit, basically credit guarantee that has been provided, for MSMEs, 100% guarantee, so that banks don't have to, think twice about the risk that they are taking. All those will also, I'm sure, help. But this is a more fundamental, aspect, and I actually am, in the economic survey that we wrote in January this year, we covered this extensively in the chapter on 50 years of bank nationalization, and I'm sure my views there are actually all of you would have read there. So we need to bite some bullets there as well. And if I may add, wait for the announcements tomorrow and day after.
Great. Now, I know we are at 6:30, but if I may ask your indulgence for a few more minutes, if that's okay with you.
Maybe last two questions.
Yeah, I precisely that. I don't know how you read my mind. You must have superior web technology than I do. But anyway, so
that's called the sixth sense.
Yes, great. So two very different topics. One, clearly there are some concerns around or questions around the agri sector, and you talked about agri reforms, etc. Farmers' impact, etc., etc. So maybe if you have some idea of the thinking behind it, how this might change, etc. That's one broad theme, and obviously along with that, jobs, employment, etc. The second one is a very completely different one, where you actually were sort of quoted in one of the pink papers this morning about no harm, if we ended up printing money type of stuff. Now, this is something that we have talked about in the past as well. So these two very different topics, but your comments and insights would be greatly appreciated. Thanks.
So firstly, let me take on the your second point. Yes, I think, see, this is a more general, any policy, no policy is ever just a benign option. In other words, every policy has its costs and benefits. And, you have to evaluate the costs and benefits with basically, monetization of the deficit. With that policy option right now, if you think about it, the benefits seem to be greater than the costs, because one of the worries oftentimes, is that monetization can create an inflationary, spiral. Given the significant deflationary impact that COVID has, it's likely that inflation may not be a big problem, and so some amount of monetization, I think, is not a problem. I would, of course, I think the quantum matters. It's like when you take a medicine, you basically, in the right dose, it actually works well, but excessive dose can basically be troublesome. So same way with monetization as well. I think within the right dose, I think it is something which is recommended. Can you just remind me your first question? Just give me a clue.
Agriculture,
yeah. So see, again, agriculture, like I was mentioning with the with the labor market, right, labor reforms, agriculture is one of the other areas as well where we've actually really imposed too many restrictions. We have not enabled agriculture markets to work, or in general markets to work itself. So we've imposed restrictions on where the farmer can sell, and as a result, one of the key problems why the small and marginal farmer really gets hurt. And by the way, I'm actually I don't have any reluctance in acknowledging that within the farming community, the rich farmers actually they end up doing really well for themselves, because they don't have to pay taxes, they don't have to they get a lot of subsidies, a lot of the subsidies end up reaching them, and so on. But it's a small and marginal farmer who ends up getting beholden to the intermediary in the APMC, and that's primarily, and it's this entity who's called an Adatya, for instance. He is someone who's basically provides the farmer credit when he needs it, albeit at usurious rates. But the farmer basically, if he's not seen another option, then he thinks that this Adatya is basically his life savior, and thereby remains beholden. And if the farmer doesn't go and sell to this Adatya, then his ability to get credit when he needs it is basically also is gone. So that's what keeps the small and marginal farmer beholden to this intermediary. As a result, a significant proportion of the value added is cornered by the intermediary. So even though the farmer is creating enough value, he or she does not end up getting a significant part of that. And that is because of the lack of enough options for the farmers. So these reforms that we are now embarking on, especially on the APMC, enabling selling, enabling the farmer to go and sell on e-markets, to sell anywhere else, actually what that does is it gives options to the farmer. But what is also important is to back this up with more formal sector credit to the farmer, because then if the farmer has credit from the formal sector, then he doesn't need to actually necessarily depend on the Adatya for basically his rainy day, financing in the rainy day. Then he really has the power, and in which case he doesn't even have to go and actually sell it to someone else. He can just go and basically the fact that he can say, "Saab, aap mujhe yadi actually aap 40 rupees nahi doge, to main jaake bech raha hu kisi aur ko actually 40 rupees pe." So where he would have been selling it at 20, now he has the bargaining power, and the Adatya also knows that he has the bargaining power. He can go and sell it to someone else, and therefore he basically does not end up cornering a big part of the share. So this is a very important part of the reform that is required for agriculture, especially enabling markets for the small and marginal farmers. I don't think we need to do anything for the rich farmers in this country. I think they've had a phenomenal set of benefits over the last 70 odd years. It's a small and marginal farmer, because the big farmer, by the way, can also access any market. Actually, can access markets outside the state. It's a small and marginal farmer for whom these restrictions actually really act as a big hindrance.
Thank you very much. And I know we are very much out of time. Your last comment does prompt me with one more comment to say we don't need to do anything for big farmers, which I would say we can do something, which is tax them. I always joke that, frankly, however politically inconvenient it may seem, but if you are going the whole hog, and your advice is mattering in terms of doing this very major, deep reforms, if I can get a whiff of what has been announced and what will come, hopefully the combination really of the stimulus, in which what I really call it is a disaster relief, because actually this whole thing is a disaster. So we shouldn't even be looking at it as a stimulus. It's really a disaster relief measure, combined with the reforms.
Semantics.
Yeah, but I mean, really, it's that, and combined with reforms is really the right way to go. And I used to always joke that, we are as a nation, and by law, we are the largest tax haven in the world, because 65% of our population or more is by legislation debarred from paying income tax, which is the people in the road. So we need to think of it that way. But thank you very much for joining us at AIMA, really, and thank you for your candid remarks. And you have provided insight into government's thinking. Big messages that I take away for all of us here, that let's not get too pessimistic. Yes, there are difficulties, but we will emerge stronger with this. And that we want to target where there can be a maximum benefits which are coming, and we will be on the job, is what I hear you saying, and respond to the needs of the people. The MSME sector in particular, the NBFCs, and trying to create a new sort of, I shouldn't say a new normal, but trying to create an alternate channel from the traditional ways of doing business is there. But since I am from the large sector, I would just reiterate on a personal note, you did say, do remember that this is also a fulcrum around which a lot of these MSMEs and the trade and commerce work. So till these are healthy enough, and we'll do that. Thank you once again for your time. Greatly appreciate it all. On behalf of AIMA, all of us, thank you.
Thank you very much. And let me just sort of last point, I think because you mentioned about reforms, I would want to actually mention that the reforms are also driven by a vision of Atmanirbhar Bharat, which I think is important to also keep in mind, because when you don't have a vision, and I think this we recognize, whether it's for companies or for countries, I think visions are important, and leaders basically are the ones that have to deliver that vision. I think in that sense, we must be thankful that the Prime Minister has actually delivered a vision. The reforms, especially on land, labor, law, and liquidity, those four actually will be the ones. I think land and labor and law are really critical. So watch out for this for the next few tranches, and especially on the reform bit.
Abhi picture baki hai.
अभी ट्रेलर तो नहीं कहूंगा, लेकिन कह लीजिए कि आपने एक तिहाई देखी है मूवी की.
Excellent. On that happy note, thank you once again. Really appreciate it. Thanks a lot, Subbu. Thank you.
Sure.
Bye.
Thank you, Dr. Subramanian, for a wonderful session. There are fantastic comments that I can see on the chat, in which you can also see on yours. So I'm not just saying that. Thank you. I know you've been in back-to-back meetings, so thank you so much for making time for AIMA. We truly appreciate it. So with these words, good night, everybody, and hopefully see you on Sunday with Mr. Nitin Gadkari from 6:30 to 7:30. Yes, we are working on Sunday also.
Rekha, we weren't able to accommodate, unfortunately, everyone's questions, but I hope some of them. Thank you once again for participating and making.
Thank you.